Hey guys, what's up? Fantasy is a huge genre, and it's not only one kind of fantasy, it's multiple different kinds of fantasies. There's a bunch of different subgenres of fantasies that kind of like are also in the fantasy classification, you know? Whenever you go to a fantasy section of a video store or a bookstore, you basically get this whole thing with like fantasy sci-fi books all put together. And in the movie store, like a video store where you can get DVDs and things like that, you also get the, sci-fi fantasy kind of put together. But fantasy is not sci-fi. Sci-fi is a completely different kind of story. They just put it together because it's like, I think they put it together because on the one hand, people think that it's kind of similar a little bit. On the other hand, they're not really into fantasy. They just like figure, oh, fantasy, sci-fi, same thing, because they really don't know anything about it. Anyone that knows anything about fantasy knows that it's completely different than sci-fi. It's a totally different experience. Like fantasy is magic and maybe medieval in the past, or the current kind of like supernatural thing happening, whereas like sci-fi is always in the future. It's always something cyberpunk. It's always something, computerized, and spaceships and planets and things like that. And it's not the same thing. Like it's just like sci-fi goes in one direction and fantasy goes in the other direction, basically. But there's a bunch of really cool subgenres of fantasy. The main fantasy subgenre is medieval fantasy. Medieval fantasy is your classic fantasy story. King Arthur, maybe the old Norse tales of like Thor and Odin, and sort of like mythological fantasy, like Clash of the Titans and stuff like that, is considered medieval fantasy. Like Conan the Barbarian is medieval fantasy. That's your main subgenre of fantasy. Like there's medieval fantasy, and so, but there's a whole bunch of other genres of fantasy that I think are really cool, like urban fantasy. Urban fantasy is sort of like a modern day story, but has a lot to do with also magic, wizards, things that are like creatures that are like supernatural creatures and things like that. Maybe monsters, maybe spirits, maybe demons, witches, things like that. Like the John Constantine stories. Like, have you ever seen the John Constantine movie with Keanu Reeves called Constantine? That is urban fantasy. It is like Constantine's a wizard, but basically he's not a wizard. Because if you say wizard, you might think of like the Hobbit, the Wizard in the Hobbit, or the Wizard Merlin and stuff like that. He's more of a magician. He's sort of like uses magic, but he's an occultist. He uses occult magic, like modern magic, and he uses a lot of like summonings and talking to demons and different spells and things like that, because his whole genre, his whole urban fantasy is fighting monsters, fighting demons. In the movie, he was fighting basically demons, and devils and all kinds of, there were angels and there was the devil in it, and there's all these different characters and stuff like that. That's a really cool subgenre of fantasy. It's modern, and it's sort of like modern day witches, modern day sorcerers, modern day occultists, and stuff like that, and modern day magic, and of course it always goes into the supernatural. That makes it really cool. If you look at something like Winona Earp, that whole series, that is basically, it's modern fantasy. It's sort of like urban fantasy. But that one's, I wouldn't say that's a urban fantasy. It's more of like a Western urban fantasy. Because it's different, it's modern day. It's not like, oh, it's in the past, or it's knights. There's no knights, there's no like dragons, there's no unicorns in it. And that's classic fantasies, dragons, unicorns, and stuff like that. And all stemmed from mythology, basically. So fantasy is just like, if you want to create a mythological story, but it's not true mythology, it's fantasy, because someone created it in the present day. If they would have created that story 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, which is when they started telling stories that are like that, about monsters and wizards and knights and things like that, thousands of years ago, it would have been mythology, because it's just an old story. It's mythology. It's just so many people have like taught it to each other and talked about it to each other. Whereas like modern day, if you make up a story now, it's got to be fantasy. So urban fantasy is huge because it's like modern day magicians, modern day supernatural things, and things like that. Another one is just your classic supernatural story, which is like modern, but at the same time talks about a lot of supernatural demons, monsters, spirits, ghosts, witches, like vampires and werewolves and things like that. That is all modern sort of like supernatural things. Like if you ever like seen anything which is like on Netflix, there's a lot of these going on, which is like all modern and stuff like that. There's also a lot of books that are made and then set in the modern time. And I think like this is a very, very cool subgenre of fantasy because it happens now, and it's interesting because it's a story. It would have been fiction otherwise, but because they want it to be like one step beyond, they put a bunch of supernatural stuff in it, like the stories, like the series Supernatural, right? Or Winona Earp or something like that, where basically there's magic weapons, there's wizards, there's spells, there's people who are immortal, there's people who are vampires, there's people who are werewolves, there's people who are demons, there's all different kinds of these like creatures. And I think that like more and more that I've seen, like it's people create and constantly create more subgenres of fantasy because they find a way to tell a story that's a fantasy story that's not conventional. Because if you remember, like in the past, like sort of like, I don't know, like years ago, right? Maybe in the 80s or something like that, there was no real urban fantasy as far as I know. Every fantasy story was like medieval fantasy. There was Conan the Barbarian, came out in the 80s. Yes, there was some sci-fi that came out, like the Terminator was like sci-fi, but it wasn't exactly fantasy. It didn't have that. It was about the future, and it was about technology. And I think like sci-fi talks about what the future might hold. So cyberpunk is a dystopian future. Other stories are like a utopian future, but fantasy is all about the world and the supernatural and the things that sort of like exist within that whole realm. It's just like sort of a one step beyond thing. It's something that, creatures that you don't think exist, but they exist in the story, It's like about creatures that kind of like don't exist, or people believe they don't exist, or whatever it is, But it's sort of about, it has a lot to do with magic, it has a lot to do with monsters, and a lot of more and more, like I see Netflix like constantly coming out with more and more of these series and these movies about fantasy. It's like people that live forever, and there's a story behind that. People that are like expert soldiers or something like that, and there's a story behind that. Everything sort of seems to be supernaturally based. A lot of these series that you see currently is in the present day, but then one step beyond, in the present day, but then there's magic, or there's sort of like deities, or there's gods, or there's wizards, or there's like strange people with strange powers and things like that. And I see more and more of this happening, and before it never happened that way. Like there wasn't any of that. Not really. Not I mean, there was John Constantine, but that was a comic book. Right? John Constantine was a comic book by Vertigo, and it was the first one. I'm not sure there was any like urban fantasy before John Constantine. John Constantine was my first experience with anything that was like fantasy, but not medieval fantasy, not like back in the medieval time, because before then fantasy was just medieval. John Constantine came out, modern day wizard, modern day fantasy, modern day monsters, modern day supernatural events, modern day magic, modern day spirits, modern day ghosts, modern day witches, all of these things where it's like it's a fantasy story, but it's in the modern day, and it's so, so cool. There are some stories about fantasy in the future, and I do think that Star Wars had some fantasy elements about fantasy in the future. The whole Jedi thing is a future fantasy story. You know, there's a lot in Star Wars that's sci-fi. It's a sci-fi story, generally speaking, but it's got a couple of fantasy elements, namely the Jedi powers, the Force, all this stuff. Yoda is basically a fantasy character, you know, but it's in the future, so you can't really call it fantasy. But they created the science fantasy, and I think science fantasy is okay because it's also fantasy. It's just like, it is basically merging science fiction and fantasy. You know, it's in the future, it's got spaceships, it's got like technology, it's got magic, you know? And most sci-fi doesn't have that. And that's what I like about fantasy. Like, you know, everyone likes sci-fi, I like sci-fi and stuff like that. But what I like about fantasy is that it's not explained by technology, it's not explained by science. You know, it cannot be explained. You know, that's why stories like Supernatural and Buffy the Vampire Slayer and all these things, they cannot explain why these people are immortal, why these people have magical powers like Underworld or something like that. You know, no one can explain why there's werewolves fighting vampires and stuff like that. You know, and it's really interesting. But if you look at something like Merlin, that story, it's in the past. It's got a dragon, it's got knights, it's got kings, it's got like all that kind of thing. And those are cool, but what I really wonder is about what the next subgenre of fantasy is going to be. Because they've taken fantasy and taken it out of the past. They still have it in the past, but they've taken it out of the past and put it in the present. So they mix the present day world with fantasy elements like spells, swords, even sword fights, even modern day knights, even modern day witches and spirits, ghosts, you know, like all kinds of creatures, but in a modern day setting. And I always wonder, like, well, what is it going to be like in the future? Like, what setting? How is fantasy going to change? Because fantasy basically changed from medieval to modern very, very quickly. So yeah, how do you think fantasy is going to change? Is there going to be another subgenre of fantasy besides what we already have? Let me know what you guys are thinking in the comments. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. Like and subscribe and check out some of my other videos, and I will see you guys in another video later.